Hey guys, it is now that time of the season where we will do our jury scenarios for Australian Survivor, Titans versus Rebels, where I'll be going through each of the possible final tribal scenarios and breaking down what I think would happen if they were to occur. And while I don't think there will be many close votes in a lot of these scenarios, I still think there's some interesting dynamics coming into these last couple of rounds and how I feel like these players would do if they got to the end. Now, at the time of recording, there are 5 players still in the game, those being Caroline, Ferris, Kirby, Mark, and Raymond. And right at the bat, I think it's pretty clear that Kirby is the biggest jury threat, where just watching the jury villa videos, you very much get the sense that Kirby is seen as the biggest threat, and that this jury would respect her game if she got towards the end. So I feel like that makes her a pretty clear favorite in a lot of these scenarios. And I feel like Ferris is not far behind her, where even though I feel like Ferris would lose to Kirby, I still think he is sort of seen as the second biggest jury threat, where if it's not Kirby, Ferris will probably inherit a lot of the jury votes that Kirby would get in a lot of these scenarios. And I feel like a lot of the people there have pretty decent relationships with him as well. Then we have Mark, who I do have at number 1 in my power rankings. And I feel like realistically, based off the edit, I feel like we're most likely to get a scenario where he ends up winning. But I feel like just inherently, I think Mark does have some allies in the jury. I feel like Valeria in particular, someone he was very close to. Alex is also someone who very openly talked about rooting for him as well. And I feel like if he gets to the end, he'll definitely have some votes there. It's just a question of whether he can get to the end against people he can beat. And that leads into who I think are the 2 smallest jury threats here, those being Caroline and Raymond. And I feel like in a lot of ways, these 2 will probably be outclassed if they get to the end against the other 3, where I feel like the jury will probably respect the games of the other 3 over them. Where yes, while Raymond has his move in taking out Valeria, I feel like outside of that, he doesn't really have many allies that are willing to vote for him outside of Ferris, I guess. And while you could point to people like Eileen as people that he worked with during a lot of the game, I don't think they're going to respect his game as much as people like Ferris, for instance. And then you have Caroline, who outside of Kitty doesn't really have anyone advocating for her, and I feel like in a lot of ways she'll be seen as this emotional player, someone who probably does not command a ton of respect there, to where I can't really see how she wins the game unless she's against Raymond, but we'll talk about the scenario soon. So in a lot of ways, I feel like there's some pretty clear jury threats coming into this, but also some pretty clear goats for lack of a better term. And then moving over to the jury, we currently have 6 people on the jury, those being Eileen, Jaden, Valeria, Alex, Rihanna, and Kitty voted out the last tribal. And for the most part, I feel like this jury leans towards Kirby and Ferris, to where if either of them get towards the end, they're probably going to vote for one of them. Though at the same time, there are some interesting aspects to this as well, where you have people like Valeria and Alex who have talked about rooting for Mark, and I feel like in a world where neither Kirby or Ferris at the end, that they're the most likely to vote for Mark there, so there's that. You also have Kitty, who has talked about hoping that Caroline can pull out the win, even though she realistically thinks that it'll be Kirby or Ferris by the end of it. So again, in a scenario where neither Kirby or Ferris are at the end, I feel like Kitty could vote for Caroline, even if it's mostly as a sympathy vote. And then the last person I wanted to talk about is Jaden, who, of the people currently on the jury, I probably have the least read on in terms of where he leans among this final 5. If I had to guess, I think he has Kirby at number 1, as in a lot of scenarios involving Kirby, it would involve her winning out, and I feel like he will respect her challenge strengths due to that. But aside from that, I think he would just inherently pick up on the fact that Kirby is the biggest threat there. And then down the line, I feel like his preferences are largely similar to the rest of the cast, with Ferris in 2nd and Mark in 3rd. So for the most part, I feel like this jury is pretty clear cut in terms of who they would vote for, though I feel like there are certain scenarios where some weird things may happen. And finally, I want to make it clear that this video will be talking about final 2 scenarios, where even though the last 2 seasons of Australian Survivor had ended with final 3s, and in general production seems to favor final 3s, we recently got an exit interview from Valeria that strongly implied that the season will end with a final 2. And even though we haven't gotten definitive proof that the season will end in a final 2 or a final 3, I will be using that to assume that the season will end with a final 2. So with all that out of the way, we do have 10 possible final 2 scenarios to break down, and I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to happen based off the game as well as what we've been seeing on the show. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final 2 scenario I believe is the least likely to happen is Caroline versus Kirby. And I feel like the reason this one is the least likely is I feel like these 2 have the least connective tissue between them, where we don't really have much of this relationship between Caroline and Kirby, to where if this were the final 2, it would be a very weird one to happen. And I feel like from a game standpoint as well, it wouldn't make a ton of sense, as even if Kirby were to win out from this point, I feel like Caroline is pretty likely to be cut along the way simply because she doesn't have as many connections and because they need challenge strength to defeat Kirby in these immunity challenges. So for those reasons, I don't think this scenario is particularly likely to happen. And to be fair, if it were to happen, I don't think it'd be very interesting where Kirby would win near unanimously, where I think the only vote up for grabs is Kitty, who could throw a sympathy vote onto Caroline, though even then I could see a world where she votes for Kirby anyway. So really, I think this is a pretty cut and dry scenario and one that I don't think is going to happen, which is why it's here number 10. Now moving on to number 9, we actually have a scenario that is probably the most interesting from a vote standpoint, but I don't think it's happening. And here we have Caroline versus Raymond. And I feel like this is the bottom 2 of my power ranking going to the finale. And I feel like neither of these two have really gotten set up to win. And while from a game standpoint, it would be a bit more straightforward as they would just take out the big threats one after the other, I just don't see a world where that happens. Although if this scenario were to happen, I do think it'd be pretty interesting, particularly with the votes being up for grabs and no one really expressing a true preference over one over the other. But I do have Raymond squeaking it out where he does get the lock votes of pretty much all of the old rebels with the exception of Alex, who I do think Alex is probably a bit more independent in this scenario and probably lean towards Caroline, considering that he did talk in his Jerry Villas video about how Caroline is being seen as his threat. And I think Caroline also gets the votes of Kitty and Jade in this scenario, but I do think the other votes in Valeria and Mark could be up for grabs where they could give Caroline the win by voting for her. Though realistically, I also see them leaning towards Raymond in this scenario, as Valeria could respect Raymond as being the one that took her out, and Mark just seeing Raymond as the better player compared to Caroline, where we've gotten a lot of setup on the show of Caroline being this emotional player. And even though Mark and Caroline have kind of had this rivalry, I'm not entirely sure if Mark would respect Caroline's game in this scenario. So again, I do think they're a bit up for grabs, but I do have Raymond getting this win by the end of it. Though considering how lackluster these two's edits have been for a lot of the season, I don't really see that this scenario happens, to where I do have it here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have 2 scenarios in a row that I don't think are particularly likely considering how the edit has been going, but we do have Ferris versus Mark. And I think the thing keeping this scenario from being higher is I just don't see how these two take each other to the end unless Kirby is the one in the final 3 with them. And while it's possible that Kirby could win her way to the final 3 to where this is the final 3, I just don't see both of them taking each other to this point to where I could see them be more likely to cut one of the others in order to take Caroline or Raymond to the end. That way, if they cut Kirby at final 3, that they have a better shot of winning, at least in the final 2 scenario that they get. So I do find it a bit far-fetched how these two get to the end together. And I think if the scenario were to happen, I think Ferris would very clearly win, getting most of the votes here. Now, I do think Mark could get some votes where I think he could get the vote of Valeria. He could also get the vote of Alex, who talked pretty highly of him in his Jury Villa video. And then you have Caroline, who could vote for Mark as a sign of respect, considering those two had a pretty big rivalry on the show. So I think that could definitely factor into things to a degree, but not enough to overtake Ferris. I still think Ferris is a pretty clear winner, but considering the circumstances that would need to happen in order to get this final 2, I don't think it's particularly likely, so I have it here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, we have another scenario that I don't think is particularly likely, and that is Kirby versus Mark. And very similar to the last scenario, I just don't see how this happens from a game standpoint where obviously Kirby would need to win out. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. But then you also need to either have Ferris be taken out before 3 so that Kirby doesn't take him over Mark. And then you also need to take out the other like bigger goats in Caroline and Raymond. So again, I don't really see this as a practicality. And if it were to happen, I think Kirby just wins unanimously, I think. Or while Mark could get some sympathy votes from Valeria or Caroline, I feel like against Kirby, it'll be much harder to do so as Valeria in particular has talked pretty highly about Kirby, and I feel like she'd be more likely to vote for Kirby against Mark versus Ferris against Mark, to where I think Kirby wins this pretty handily. But again, the things that would need to happen for us to get this scenario are pretty unlikely, to where I have it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, we have a scenario kind of similar to one we talked about earlier, but I feel like this one has a bit more legs to stand on, and here we have Caroline versus Ferris. And again, I think this one is a bit more likely to happen than Caroline versus Kirby, or at least we have a relationship between Caroline and Ferris on the show, to where it's possible it could happen. And plus, in this scenario, you could also have Kirby being cut at 3 by either of them if they win final immunity. So again, I think this one has a bit more setup for it happening. And I think if it were to happen, I think Ferris wins pretty handily as well, where the only possible vote that Caroline could get is from Kitty. But aside from that, I feel like every other vote is pretty locked in for Ferris. So again, I feel like this would be a pretty clear Ferris win. And it's one that I think is a bit more likely to happen than the other ones we already talked about. But again, not as likely as the others, so I have it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and again, I also debated this one to a degree. I consider putting this one lower, but at the end of the day, I think this one has a viable path to happening, and that is Kirby versus Raymond. Now, I think the one thing about this one is it would involve Ferris not being in the final 3, where through that, I could see Kirby more relatively taking Raymond to the end over the likes of Mark, for instance. But at the same time, it's also Kirby, so you never quite know. And then you also have Raymond potentially winning final immunity and somehow taking Kirby, which I think is a bit more far-fetched. But again, I feel like this is a more classic final 2 scenario where you have a clear jury thread and a clear person that they would be at the end. And I think if it were to happen, I think Kirby wins near unanimously, where even people like Ferris and Eileen that would seem a bit closer to Raymond would probably respect Kirby's game more to where they vote for her instead. So again, I feel like this one is a pretty cut and dry case as well. But again, I feel like the other scenarios are more likely to happen compared to it, to where I have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, we have a very similar scenario, just swapping out one person. And here we have Ferris versus Raymond. And again, I feel like this one is a bit more likely to happen considering that it's possible in the scenario for Kirby to be cut here, where obviously Ferris could win final immunity, decide to go back on his deal with Kirby to take her out there. You also have Raymond possibly winning final immunity as well, taking a Kirby as she's a bigger threat to win compared to Ferris. So again, I think there is a world where this scenario could happen, not to mention that Ferris and Raymond have a very established relationship on the show. And I think if it were to happen, Ferris wins unanimously, where I can't really see a single vote leaning towards Raymond, or at least in the Kirby Raymond scenario, there is an argument for Raymond getting the votes of Ferris, but in this scenario, he doesn't even get that. So I think this is a pretty down the line Ferris vote for me. And I think with it being a bit more likely to happen than Kirby versus Raymond, I do have it here number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we probably have the most interesting scenario to talk about coming into this. And here we have Ferris versus Kirby. Now, if I were to make this video last week, I would have said that there's no way that this scenario happens, considering the clear rivalry that Ferris and Kirby have had for most of the season, until we learned during this past week of episodes that Kirby actually wants this scenario to happen. She wants to go to the final 2 with Ferris because she wants to beat the best. And again, I already criticized Kirby quite a bit in my power ranking for this mentality, where it very much feels like you're just stroking your own ego versus taking the win. And at the same time, I do question whether Ferris would actually go along with this, or even though we've gotten content on the show in the past week about how Ferris very much values his relationship with Kirby and that he sees her as his sister and her equal in the game. At the same time, I feel like Ferris is more likely to cut Kirby if the opportunity presented itself compared to anyone else, and that a large reason why he kept her in the game this past week was, aside from Kirby's immunity wins, him needing her as a shield in the game. So again, I feel like coming into this end stretch, if Ferris had the opportunity to cut Kirby if she fails to win immunity, I do think there's a world where he takes that option. But at the same time, there's also a chance that Kirby just wins out to where he's kind of forced into this final 2 scenario. So again, I do question whether Ferris would actually go along with this. But despite me criticizing Kirby for having this mentality, wanting to beat the best, I actually think Kirby wins this scenario pretty handily, where I do think she gets the majority of the votes here. Or even though most of the jury has talked pretty highly of Ferris in their Jury Villa videos, I think Kirby's pretty clearly their favorite, in that in a world where Ferris allows this final 2 scenario to happen, that they'd be more likely to reward Kirby with the win at the end of the day. But really the only vote I see going to Ferris is probably Raymond. But really every other vote, I feel like they see Kirby as the best player. I feel like they would respect the game that she played, even though I personally would have some qualms with it. But it's kind of funny that despite Kirby having the wrong mindset for how to approach this endgame, it may end up working out for her anyway, so I do find that kind of funny. But again, I just don't see Kirby winning this season considering her edit and how it very much feels like she's being set up for a fall down the road, to where I do have this scenario here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and spoiler alert, the top 2 both have Mark in it, and not Kirby or Ferris, which is pretty interesting there. By number 2, I did decide to have Mark versus Raymond. And again, I feel like with me feeling like Mark is the most likely winner of the season based on the way that the show is presenting him, I feel like it's probably likely that Mark gets towards the end against people that he can reasonably beat. And obviously Raymond is one of them. where I feel like it's pretty clear that they just take out the big threats and Ferris and Kirby along the way. Maybe final three, Mark wins final immunity and cuts them at that point to get this final two scenario. And again, I think Mark pretty clearly wins this scenario, getting most of the votes there. I feel like the one vote that could go to Raymond is Ferris, considering their relationship. But at the same time, it would be in a spot where Ferris would recognize that Mark is the better player, but more so saw Raymond as his close friend for a lot of the season. So again, it is a pretty cut and dry vote, but considering that I think Mark is the most likely winner of the season, that I feel like Kirby is very much being set up for a downfall, and would shock me if Ferris falls right after her. I do think that leaves Mark as the most likely winner, and I feel like this scenario would make a decent amount of sense, but not as much as the number one option, to where I have it here at number two. And now, at number one, the final two scenario I believe is the most likely to happen on this season is Caroline versus Mark. And I think what separates this one from the Mark Raymond scenario is Caroline and Mark have this pretty clear rivalry that has defined a lot of the season. Where early on the pre-merge, we had Caroline getting this big edit with her like getting a one-up on Mark over and over again. But then more recently, you have him dropped off in the edit and being shown more negatively. In a lot of ways, if we are comparing this to Survivor US, that does remind me of a runner-up edit, and I feel like Caroline could be getting that step to a runner-up edit. And at the same time, I feel like with Mark having this resurgence in the last couple rounds, taking out these big threats in Ferris and Kirby, I could see a world where it all culminates in Caroline and Mark getting to the end together, where Mark finally gets the one-up on Caroline at that point. I have said in my previous power rankings that I felt like Mark was being set up to take out Caroline at some point, but that just hasn't happened as Mark never had the chance to vote out Caroline. But it would be kind of interesting now to see Mark getting to the end with Caroline in a spot where he clearly outplays her and he's able to paint her as this emotional player and one that was able to take out all the big threats along the way. So I think in a lot of ways that would be pretty interesting. And again, if this scenario were to happen, I think Mark would win pretty handily. Really, the only vote I could see going to Caroline is Kitty, but I feel like Mark would be seen as the better player in this scenario. But again, I feel like this scenario has a pretty interesting setup for it to happen from an edit standpoint, and I think from a gameplay standpoint, there's definitely room for it to happen as well, to where I have it here at number one. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, after the season is over, I plan to do a player ranking for this season, so you can look forward to that. And I'm doing coverage on a whole bunch of shows at this point, so you can look forward to weekly power rankings on those. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.